In 2008, 19-year-old college student Brendan Swanson was driving home after a night out when he crashed into a ditch on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Knowing how dangerous of a predicament he found himself in, and probably aware he was in a cliché horror movie setup, he called his parents and asked for a ride. However, his parents had trouble finding him, and when arriving to the location, he provided they couldn't find his car. So they got back on the phone for over 45 minutes trying to find him as he described his location. Swenson claimed he could see lights from a nearby town and was heading in that direction, but things took a turn for the worse when he suddenly yelled, "Oh shit," before his father could even scold his son for using that language on the phone with him. The call cut off, and that's the last anyone ever heard from Brendan. Even with hundreds of volunteers and 30 dogs searching, only his car was found. So what happened to him? What did he see that made him go, "Oh shit," before abruptly hanging up? In 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass worked as a nurse at a first aid station of a casino in South Lake Tahoe, California. One day, Donna's boss and landlord both received calls from an unidentified man who claimed she was dealing with an illness in the family and would be out of town for a while. Donna's boss became suspicious, so he contacted her mother, who confirmed that the story was a lie. Donna's car was found parked outside her apartment, but there was no trace of her anywhere. The last sign of her was an entry she'd made in her logbook near the end of her final shift. The entry looked unfinished, as if someone had possibly interrupted her. No one could figure out Donna's whereabouts or the identity of the caller until the San Francisco Chronicle received a mysterious postcard 6 months later. The postcard was the latest in a long line of cryptic messages from the Zodiac Killer. The killer made no direct reference to Donna, but hinted that he had murdered and buried his 12th victim in Lake Tahoe. It didn't take a detective to make connection between this note and Donna's disappearance. The postcard provided a lot of possible clues regarding Donna's whereabouts, but a search of the area turned up nothing. Something complicates a connection between the Zodiac Killer and Donna, though, and that's the fact that the Zodiac Killer was not known for hiding bodies. So, if he wasn't responsible in whereabouts of Donna's body and who tried to hide her disappearance, remain a mystery. In 2015, student Michael Andrews of the University of Southern California had left his dorm room with his roommate Steve to go to a frat party off campus. On the way to the party, Steve had realized he left his phone in the dorm room, but already in the Uber to the party, they didn't bother going back to the dorm. At some point during the party, while the two friends had separated to mingle with other friends and acquaintances, Michael's phone began to ring. It was from Steve's number. He picked up and heard Steve's voice on the other end, covered by a mask of static. Even in the loud of party, he could distinguish the voice of his roommate saying, "Come back to the room," and then call ended. With that, Michael left the party and Ubered back to the campus dorm, trying to call Steve back and text him, but he wasn't getting any responses. When Michael got back to the dorm room, he didn't find Steve inside. Strangely though, he did find Steve's phone sitting on his bed upon checking the notifications on the screen. Michael saw the notifications of all his texts and calls on the screen. It wasn't until an hour later that Steve returned to the room looking for Michael after hearing that he left. And this was when he told Michael that he never called him and that he never had his phone. What made this even stranger was that Steve's phone had no record of making a call to Michael. Yet Michael's phone had a record of receiving a call and having a 15-second conversation. The phone company wasn't able to trace a call from Steve's side, and nobody was found hiding in their dorm room or anything like that. Few years back, a Reddit user named Stacy Kolopsky shared the experience of her brother who would get a call on his cell phone around 2 or 3 a.m. every night. He would answer it every time to hear this hellish sounding noise that he described as a static mixed with screams. He changed his cell phone number after a month of this, and it stopped then. After a week or so, it began again with the exact same noise at the exact same time. Finally, one day, he decided to backdial the call, and an old man picked up who had no idea what he was talking about. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times, but no messages were ever left. He decided to say screw it and ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. And exactly what he feared had happened. The screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time, he was terrified every night, unsure why this was happening. He backdialed the number again and got a different person who also had no idea what he was talking about. Around this time, Stacy's brother lost his job and his phone, which was now disconnected, meaning the calls of course stopped. One day, Stacy's mom asked her to listen to a weird message she got on her home phone. It was a static screaming they showed her brother, and he of course freaked out. He backdialed the number again and it said the number was disconnected. This time, they never heard from it again after that. In the 1970s, Bashir Kawashaki opened a successful restaurant in Washington, D.C., and for over a decade enjoyed nothing but success. But in 1983, he became the target of non-stop stream of threatening phone calls that came several times a day, every day. Usually, harassment similar to this will eventually stop on its own as the harassers get bored and move on to something else. But Kawashaki was harassed by these phone calls for nearly a decade. The caller would eventually be nicknamed L'Enfant, which in French for the child, the nickname was presumed to reference the caller's eventual imitation of a little girl. Anyone associated with Kawashaki in any way was a target, from his pregnant spouse to his restaurant employees. The harassment was one day elevated from simply phone calls to physical harassment, when the Star of David was scratched all over Kawashaki's Mercedes. When he traveled to Philadelphia to visit his sister, things got so bad that he suffered a mental breakdown and committed himself to a psychiatric ward. But even still, the calls continued to his restaurant. The FBI eventually placed a trace on the phone to confirm whether L'Enfant was a delusion or not, and what they found out put how bad this was into perspective. The calls were coming from different pay phones at such a high frequency that it would have been impossible for only one person to have been making these calls. The L'Enfant callers was a plot, orchestrated by multiple people for the express purpose of harassing Kawashaki to insanity, but it was never figured out what the motive was.